Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antony Froggatt, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. I'd like to welcome you to this session, What Does Success Look Like in a Super Year for the Climate? Before inviting our speakers to take the floor, I'll just make a few introductory remarks. Firstly, just to say that this event is taking place on the record and it is being recorded. And so for that reason, we won't be reading out names or asking you to join the discussion with videos, because that raises questions in terms of privacy. And so therefore, please do put your comments in the Q&A throughout the discussions so that I can then pull upon these and put these to the panelists. This is one event of 12 that is run by Chatham House during London Climate Action Week, and we are very grateful to the organisers for this as an opportunity to discuss these key issues with members of the public and key actors from not just London but from all over the world. 2020 was supposed to be the super year for the environment, but in some ways, like the Euros, it's been delayed. And in this case, I think it has been delayed in somewhat to an advantage in terms of climate change. Because if it had taken place in 2020, we would still be having President Trump overseeing some of these discussions rather than Biden. So we can see that there is a new opportunities for us as we approach COP26 and some of the other key events on environment taking place in the second half of this year. Now, the topic is clearly quite a difficult one. What does success look like? And we probably won't reach an overall conclusion. However, what we are hoping to discuss will be the key issues for COP26 and some of the other summits. What are the opportunities and barriers for further ambition? And which are the countries and groupings that will significantly influence this outcome? And it would also be interesting for us to hear from you in terms of how you judge success. What do you think are these key issues? So we are really hoping to make this as interactive as possible. So as I said at the beginning, please do put your comments and questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will refer to these in the second half of this session. Just for those that don't know, Chatham House is a foreign affairs think tank. We are based in London, and I work in the Energy, Environment, Resources Department, which engages in research, convening and policy interactions across a whole range of sustainability issues. And consequently, we have a permanent research staff and many associate fellows who work with us on a part-time basis, but also work in other institutions. And therefore, the programme has quite a broad range of experiences and networks. And this is why I'm delighted today that we have an amazing representation of these researchers and associate fellows to share their thoughts and wisdom with you. So I'll just introduce them from the outset, but you'll see their full bios in the chat shortly. So firstly, I'll be asking Dr. Sam Geall to take the floor. He's an associate fellow here with us at Chatham House, but he's also executive director of China Dialogue and associated with the University of Sussex. His research focuses on climate policy and politics, energy transition and energy governance in China, as well as Chinese investment in the Belt and Road. And so has a really incredible depth of knowledge that he will share with us today. Anna Åberg is a research analyst at Chatham House, where she's working on international climate politics, the UN climate negotiations, climate finance and climate risk. Prior to joining Chatham House, she was a desk officer at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on global and ocean issues, humanitarian policy, and Sweden's relationship with the World Bank. And finally, we have Farhana Yamin, who is an internationally recognized environmental lawyer, climate change and development policy expert. She was voted number 2 in the BBC's BBC Power List, where the judges described her as a powerhouse of climate justice, and is active in numerous community-based social initiatives in Camden. 2 other things really worth highlighting in terms of Farhana here is a long-standing experience in working with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and I really don't think it's modest to say on her behalf, but I think she was widely credited in getting the goal of net zero emissions by mid-century into the Paris Agreement, which is really a tremendous achievement. So we really have, as I said, an amazing set of speakers with a great broad set of experiences. So Sam, maybe I can turn to you first. Through your sort of Chatham House hat, you published a paper on the questions about this year, the super year, and its potential for 2021. This was published in March. Maybe you could sort of talk through what you thought in terms at the time were the main outputs, but also what do you think may have changed in the following sort of 4 or 5 months?
Thanks, Anthony. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Yeah, so I mean, the paper set out really initial kind of theory of why the super year is important. And that comes down to, quite a simple idea that global problems, whether we're talking about ocean conservation or climate change, tax havens or debt relief, require global solutions. And that the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated very vividly how international cooperation, action and ambition can be obstructed by competition, by suspicion, by protectionism, and how costly the results of those failures can be. I think that's evident in COVID-19, that when individual nations hoard crucial vaccines, as is a real problem today, or fail to share public health information internationally, global efforts to exit the pandemic, or at least to better manage its consequences, are being harmed. And just as achieving coordination and leadership is necessary for that exit strategy for the pandemic and for an economic recovery from COVID-19, it's needed too for climate change and for all of the sustainable development goals. And of course, this is taking place in a context where the world order is ever more fragmented, where tensions are rising geopolitically. I would say thanks to a sort of a longer term shift in the balance of economic power from west to east and an increasingly multipolar system that is sort of challenging the post-war international rules and institutions. The pandemic, of course, isn't the cause of that, but has acted as an accelerant. And that is, we see that through rising US-China tensions, to rising attacks on the multilateral system. We see it in the sort of reshaping of global supply chains. In all of these cases, I think we can see where COVID-19 is something of a crisis or a turning point for globalization, and also how it shows us something about the nature of these sort of fragmented systems across the globe, where stresses and shocks can risk these kind of cascading negative effects or vicious circles. The pandemic, of course, has sort of many vivid examples of this, but climate change presents similar risks. A drought in one geography might lead to an economic effect in another, which might spiral into social or political effect in another geography. The theory of the super year that's sort of put forward in the paper is that actually there is an alternative to this, which is the generation of a virtuous circle rather than a vicious circle. In other words, just as failure to act within one system can obstruct action within others, positive interplays can be created by coordinating multiple levers for change between systems. So where an action towards a policy goal actually strengthens the likely achievement of other goals rather than creating trade-offs. So that's the promise of a super year. And the idea, of course, was that you could realize a kind of green recovery in 2021 by achieving a coordination between multilateral organizations, national governments, regional organizations to exercise greater leadership, to pursue a shared vision for global coordination, what we call in the paper an arc of engagement. And I would see those sort of primarily across, for example, the 3 Rio conventions, all of which have their summits this year. The CBD COP15 taking place in Kunming in the autumn for the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNFCCC COP26, of course, the UN Food Summit, as well as the Biodiversity Desertification Convention. And you can find even within these sort of overarching themes, such as the circular economy or nature-based solutions, as models that could offer that kind of suggestion of a more synergetic virtuous circle type approach. We also see the rollout of China's 14th five-year plan this year, the European Green Deal, the G7, the G20, President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit. So the concept of the super year there wasn't really to find a single solution, and wasn't to suggest that there are sort of silver bullets, as much as there is this need for a multilateral approach and for kind of iterative approaches across multilateral systems that are responsive to feedback, that make these links and that bind together and kind of intensify the coordination that's needed. In terms of the state of play, on the positive side, we have seen a lot of momentum around the net zero pledges, for example. Sort of for me, that some of the momentum, I guess, starts with the UNGA in 2060, where President Xi's announcement of a net zero goal did, I think, was a really significant moment, because it was on a multilateral stage, but actually also because it was a unilateral announcement, one that's very tied to his political legacy, one that we're seeing sort of fleshed out in policy making, and one that I think is a significant market signal. We also saw a net zero commitment from the United States for mid-century. We've seen rising ambition in some of the NDCs that have already been pledged, including from the UK, which is important as the COP26 host. And we saw some momentum coming from the Climate Leaders Summit, South Korea's pledge to end coal finance being, a particular high point. In the run-up to that summit, we also did see cooperation sort of rising up between US and China. John Kerry, the US climate envoy, and his Chinese counterpart made a joint statement. There was also an EU-China statement on the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. But there's a really long way to go, and there's a lot of unfortunately kind of very open questions about whether this potential can be achieved. There's a lot I could point to. I guess three that I'll use in my remaining time, just to get across 3 points that I think we'll probably come back to. One is that we're really a long way from 1.5 degrees on the climate targets, and it's very unclear how we're supposed to sort of close that gap without much higher ambition coming from the COP26 host, and in general from the kind of momentum so far under the UNFCCC. The second I might note is actually the big question around how we get a better deal for nature. Clearly, one of the big kind of promises of the super year agenda was to try and make this link around nature-based solutions between climate and biodiversity, to make progress on things like reforming subsidies so that they don't contribute to further deforestation and biodiversity loss. But so far, the kind of momentum around the CBD process is very lacking. There's a lot of blame to go around on all sides, and COVID hasn't helped. But clearly, neither the CBD executive and secretariat, nor the hosts, China, seem to be putting sort of adequate force behind this to produce the kind of momentum that will be needed for a new global deal for nature in Kunming. And finally, there's the big question about the way that the kind of solidarity that needs to be extended to the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries is addressed. And it's a much bigger question we can get into. It's not only about climate finance, for example, but it's also about vaccines. But evidently, the world's poorest, most climate vulnerable countries are facing a really dire situation. The demand shock caused by lockdowns in rich countries has affected developing countries very significantly. Many of them are very reliant on commodity exports. This has led, of course, to an economic crisis and a debt crisis in many countries that's much worse than the health crisis in the first place. And without an adequate sort of offer from rich countries on this, at the very least addressing the 100 billion per year target announced in 2015, as well as the other major concerns of the climate vulnerable countries like loss and damage and adaptation, I really feel that we're missing out on an opportunity to see progress on the super year. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Great, Sam. Thanks very much indeed. It's always really handy as a chair when someone summarizes their key points at the end. So yeah, the 1.5 degrees, the better deal for nature, and the solidarity, in terms of poverty, are key things that we will come back to during the discussion. But maybe I can hand over to Anna. As I mentioned, Anna is a research associate at Chatham House. She's been running a briefing series for the diplomatic community over the last year So please do look at that on the Chatham House website. There's some amazing podcasts. But yeah, I mean, maybe on the basis of that, maybe you could give us some of your key insights into what you think a successful COP might look like. How might that be achieved? And in some ways, what are the challenges and opportunities that we still face?
Thanks, Anthony. Happy to. And hello, everyone. It's really great to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So at and ahead of COP26, we really need to make progress in a few different areas. The first is on mitigation. The Paris Agreement is designed to increase ambition over time. And one key goal for Glasgow, or benchmark for success, if you wish, is that all countries submit new or updated NDCs, and that these are much more ambitious than the last round, so that we get on track for a 1.5-degree pathway. Where do we stand on this? Well, some progress has been made. I mean, quite a lot of parties have submitted new or updated NDCs now, and some of these have been relatively ambitious. But as Sam said, we're really still far away from where we need to be. So we really need governments to ramp up their action in the last few months. We are still awaiting a few NDCs from a few large emitters, but closing this gap won't be easy. But COP26 is not just about mitigation. It's also about being more ambitious on finance, on adaptation, on loss and damage, and it's about finalizing the so-called Paris Rulebook, which is like an implementation guide for the Paris Agreement. So in terms of finance, the key thing here is really that developed countries need to honor a pledge they made back in 2009. So, ages ago, of mobilizing $100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries. So far, developed countries have not been able to demonstrate that this goal has been met or how they will achieve it over the coming years, because it's not just about mobilizing this 1 year, it needs to be delivered every single year up to 2025. There was, of course, a lot of hope that G7 leaders would provide greater clarity on this when they met in Cornwall a few weeks ago. And, some commitments were made, but it was not enough. And I think most would agree that the G7 under-delivered on this front. And this is not okay. I mean, climate vulnerable countries, they need the money. They need a lot more than 100 billion for climate finance. And it's also very much an issue of trust, which is critical in the UN climate negotiations. I think, so there needs to be clarity on the 100 billion ahead of COP26, and the sooner the better. And I also think there needs to be a special push to ramp up finance, both for adaptation and for loss and damage. And we also need to facilitate access to finance. As Antony mentioned, I run something called the Diplomatic Briefing Series, and we had the honor of hosting the ambassador of the Maldives a few months ago. And what she said was that it feels like you need a PhD in climate finance in order to get hold of any funds. And I think this sentiment seems to be echoed in many countries across the world. I think it's also good to mention that the deliberations on a new finance goal are due to start at COP26 for the period after 2025. And it's important that these discussions get off on a good start. Other important issues related to adaptation and loss and damage include making progress on kind of developing guidelines or metrics for assessing the global goal on adaptation in the Paris Agreement, and fully operationalizing the Santiago network on loss and damage, the purpose of which is to catalyze technical assistance for loss and damage. In terms of finalizing the Paris Rulebook, I think, of course, it would be great if a deal could be reached, but it can't come at any cost. We need to make sure that environmental integrity is maintained. So those are a few of the main issues. There is a lot on the table. There is a lot at stake, and quite frankly, it won't be easy. I think one major challenge is just to achieve the ambition we need on mitigation, even if. As I mentioned, we're still waiting NDCs from a few large countries, but even if these are on the more ambitious side, it will be difficult to close the gap to 1.5 degrees. And should we reach COP26 without sufficient ambition on mitigation, it will be important to kind of set out a path or a vision for how to close that gap in the next few years. The pandemic, of course, poses another enormous challenge. In large parts of the world, vaccination rates are still incredibly low. And it's difficult to prioritize, let alone afford climate adaptation and mitigation when you're struggling and having to deal with a massive health catastrophe, when people are dying, and when your economy is in, well, I can't even find the words, like destroyed. So, and also this kind of this inequity we're seeing in global vaccine access, of course, it also undermines kind of global trust, trust between countries. And that can also spill into the climate talks. And I'm sure it would impact the negotiations in the CBD process as well. So we need to ramp up kind of this push to vaccinate the world. Again, what the G7 delivered the other week was not enough. And in addition to that, I mentioned the 100 billion in climate finance. That's really crucial to deliver. But I and many others think that there needs to be a broader push on this front. It's really positive with the SDRs discussion. That seems to be pretty much a done deal now. But what we need to see is that the richer countries kind of choose to give up some of their shares or the proportion of SDRs in favor of developing countries. And it would also be good, as I think Sam mentioned, if we could do more about debt relief to make sure that we all get out of this crisis. Of course, the pandemic also has very practical implications for COP26. I mean, how to host a safe and inclusive in-person event in just a few months' time. It's very positive and, frankly, quite high time that the UK has announced that it will, vaccinate or help provide vaccines to delegations that wouldn't have access to these otherwise. But still, I mean, logistic hurdles will remain, and a lot of the work also needs to take place before COP26. And as you know, we've just come out of these subsidiary body sessions, and a lot of delegations they're pointing to difficulties and with conducting these talks online, and there are lots of question marks around kind of the status of the documents coming out of those meetings. But Antony, to finish off, you also asked me to point to a few kind of sources of optimism or opportunities. And I think I'd mentioned 3, which are related to climate action more broadly. The first is that climate change has really soared up on the political agenda in the last few years. I mean, everybody's talking about this now. And we're seeing, as Sam mentioned, a lot of countries making pledges. And of course, it's massively important that we have a new president in the White House. The second is that the economics of acting on climate change have really improved. The cost of renewable energy has fallen dramatically. And we're increasingly seeing, I mean, at least in some countries, that it's seen very much as an issue of being economic competitive to kind of invest in climate action, to be at the frontier of green technologies, that it's seen as a way of being competitive, both in the economy of today, but especially in the economy of tomorrow. And of course, this type of, it's not good if competition results in adversarial politics, but fundamentally, I think that this kind of race to the top competition is a good thing, as long as it's also combined with cooperation when needed. The final thing I'd point to is that there's so much public engagement around these issues now, and this is a really critical thing, and I think it's fantastic seeing, or not least the youth movements all over the world that are demanding action from governments and politicians to do more. So I think that's a big source of hope as well. I think my time is up. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Anna, thank you very much, and again for summarising coming with 3 positive outcomes. In particular, the last one, because it leads me very nicely onto the question that I was hoping to address to Farhana. In terms of, obviously, you have such a great depth of knowledge in terms of the processes and the engagement of the different parties. So, what role do you think that civil society and NGOs can play in shaping this, in particular in relation to Glasgow? And therefore, what do you think of the sort of opportunities that we have in terms of the super year?
Well, thank you, Rob, Antony, sorry, Sam, and to Anna and to Chatham House for the very kind introduction as well. I guess, in terms of my own sort of career spanning those 30 30 years of negotiations since 1991, I'm putting more of my time in social movements and spending slightly less of my time on academic reports and research and seminars, which is not to say that our contribution isn't important. It's hugely important. But in essence, I feel that our systems of governance, our democracies have been captured by power, by vested interests, and they have been hugely resistant to the insider conversations. They've been hugely resistant to change. They have used their enormous financial, economic, and political power to suppress, delay, deny, and ultimately thwart many of the ideas that would have made reaching 2 degrees, let alone 1.5, achievable. And so that is the reckoning, we're seeing in terms of the Earth's tipping points, and the legal reckoning that's coming now via the courts, including demands for, new concepts like ecocide. That demand is very much the result of a huge degree of frustration and our failure collectively to have delivered the objectives of all of the Rio Conventions, which I was actually part of the forest principles, to a certain extent the biodiversity convention, and I focused and specialized on the climate change one, and we had something called Agenda 21, which was supposed to be this bottom-up transformational work, which in fact left a huge layer of understanding at the local level and at the cities level, which was then lost for many reasons. So I guess looking back at that history, I feel more than ever we need at COP26 to bring the full weight of our understanding and our history and our now a judgment on why things have been delayed and why we are at this point, which is very, very grave in terms of the future of most parts of the world, especially vulnerable ecosystems, especially vulnerable countries. And they are coming to Glasgow, if they come at all, with a very heavy heart and with a complete atmosphere of distrust and a degree of skepticism about whether multilateralism works, at the same time knowing that this is one of the few fora, these meetings, the UN meetings, especially the climate change meetings, are where they have the opportunity to hold the powerful, the rich, the elites to account. On this emissions gap, Anna, so I think the UNEP gap report started in 2010. It started just after Copenhagen, which was the first time we had this reference to 1.5. So the 1.5 degree goal isn't some kind of surprise. It was the die in the ditch issue for the countries that I was working with, the Maldives, the small island states, Grenada on behalf of the small islands, and 100 vulnerable countries said they did not want and would not agree to the 2 degree limit being enshrined in law without also a reference that it be reviewed. And it's taken 10 years to have that review, and even longer for the world to accept it. So again, the good news is that it was referenced in the G7 summit, and there is a much greater understanding and awareness that this 0.5 degree is enormously important. But at the same time, we've had year after year of gap reports, and in Paris itself, I'm sort of going to hold this up, paragraph 17, we put the then gap that was evident, which we knew that there was a projected gap. Essentially, we had to go from 55 gigatons to 40 gigatons in Paris in 2015, and we put that into the accompanying decisions, and that was for the 2 degrees. And for 1.5, the IPCC report, which came out in 2018, and subsequent carbon budgeting, said actually it's nearer 25 or 25 gigatons, and we are miles away from that, despite the huge reductions in cost of renewables, despite the huge gains that have been made in our understanding of the role of buildings, transport, and decarbonising all of those. And huge amounts of progress is there, but it's not accelerating fast enough, because we have this dead hand of political power and incumbency and huge lobbying efforts. And that's why I did glue myself to the headquarters of Shell, and I frankly feel that made much more of a difference than me writing another report about that. And I think that that's what the new social movements, whether it's the school strikers, whether it's the Green New Deal ideas, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's existing, Greenpeace, who just did the undercover story of, an Exxon, a senior figure from Exxon, admitting freely that, they know no one's going to adopt carbon pricing. I don't know how many reports Chatham House, let alone my colleagues worldwide, have written on carbon pricing, but they know that carbon pricing won't happen. So they happily go along with that in order to provide a bit of greenwashing. And I think that this veneer of action, this co-opting of language, this deliberate acceptance of tools that are either undermined or they know are going to be not taken forward, is one of the reasons why COP26 is in danger, frankly. And we have to adjust now the Paris pathway. We cannot stick to the timelines that the Paris Agreement had, which was to have this global stock take and the ratchet, and then a further round of enhancements in 2025. So this 5-year cycle, which was at the heart of progressive ratcheting down, is way off track. And I would love to I'm very proud of Paris and the role that we all played in getting some of the most progressive ideas in there, but it's not working. And we need to put faith back in the system and have an earlier, much earlier than 2025 enhancement of ambition, whether it's through the formalized NDCs or another platform or set of mechanisms. So that would be an essential part of restoring the integrity of the Paris package, alongside the rule book, alongside making sure that the markets, to the extent that they are going to go ahead, actually deliver real action, do not outsource responsibility, liabilities, and push them on to countries that are very vulnerable. Once again, that adaptation financing is included in these carbon markets, and fundamentally that they have integrity. And I'm much more interested in carbon insetting, not carbon offsetting. So how can your own project sequester and be carbon positive rather than pay someone else to go and do it for you? So I think these sorts of demands and asks are really critical. Anna's already talked about the 100 billion being an absolutely critical sum, and there's no real reason for the rich countries to now wait till Glasgow to deliver that. That was a trust building exercise to deliver that, and the amount of funding that is going to mitigation is 80% of climate finance goes to mitigation, only roughly 20% goes to adaptation. And again, in Copenhagen, the balance between adaptation and mitigation, this is 2009, was made. And so we're so far off track because only 20% roughly of that, the existing climate finance is going to adaptation. And of that, only 2% goes to small islands and 14% goes to LDCs. So the very vulnerable countries that are about 80, 90 countries are getting peanuts. And so they are losing faith, they are losing hope, they're feeling massively disenchanted as to why accessibility is not a bigger issue and doesn't get more time. And I think finally, I think I've got a minute or so. So the big question really is how we deal with our own denial about what the decade of delay, 2 decades of delay has been. So we had a decade of delay when we had Kyoto. Is it going to happen? Isn't it going to happen? Is there a second commitment period? We've had another decade of delay where we didn't make good on any of those gap reports. We acknowledged them. I was there. I was drafting every year out, another COP decision, responding to a bigger gap, which was all supposed to be plugged by 2020, and that hasn't happened. So we've hit 2020, and it was only because of COVID that we had, the downturn, which is now all being eroded as economies recover and go back to worse versions of themselves in some ways, in some countries, in building in fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's why there is this demand, and absolutely won't go away, for loss and damage. And loss and damage, again, in the Paris Agreement, my mandate as a lawyer and as a strategist and advisor was to negotiate a separate article with the big picture headline words, loss and damage, so that there's denial of what the consequences now are of this delay, on what the consequences are of not paying enough attention to resilience and adaptation in the last 20 years, what that is, and that is residual resulting loss and damage. And this is decimating, you know, many vulnerable countries, displacement, droughts, floods, hurricanes, you know, the statistics and the figures are really awful. And on top of that, as Anna has said, you know, the words to describe what is happening in real life to the economies of these countries, you know, small islands, the Maldives, you know, 80% of their income comes from tourism, which is now off the table, vanished overnight. It's not coming back in any shape or form. And so debt relief, a fundamental restructuring of the global economy so that it truly protects the vulnerable, a global delivery of biodiversity, an end to biodiversity losses, of stopping, you know, nature being killed. You know, there's no point having nature-based solutions if actually all that's happening, including in this country, as we've just seen the UK report, you know, our biodiversity has been decimated over the last 30 years and we're nowhere on track to that. So I think these are the fundamental reality checks that COP26 has to grapple with, and it has to come up with a clearer and more honest storyline and an end result than just saying, oh, we've delivered these updated NDCs and oh, sorry, they don't add up, but let's all come back in 2025 and put in, you know, 10-year NDCs that kick the story down much later down the line again. So I am optimistic, though, that the economy and the world is moving much faster, and people, especially our young people all over the world, are holding politicians to account, and they're using innovative techniques, whether it's litigation, whether it's direct action, whether it's setting up new commissioners for the future. There's all sorts of new things that are happening that are making sure that investors also change their tune very quickly. You know, you've had shareholder actions at Shell and Chevron and Exxon, which have resulted in more climate-friendly boards being installed. So the jury is out as to whether we can turn things around quickly, but we still have a long way to go, and COP26 must lay its provide a roadmap for all of those things. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Farhana. Real food for thought. I'm glad you finished on an optimistic note, because much of what you were saying, I think, was cutting into the bone and a bit depressing. But as you said, you finished up on the optimistic note. Could I pick up on one of the points that I think runs through the theme of all three presentations? Farhana, in particular, you talked about the sort of the NDC cycle being too slow, and 2.5-year reporting, maybe than 5-year reporting. And both Anna and Sam mentioned the NDC increases that we've seen in recent months. So it's sort of a bit of a question is, we've seen some countries increasing their NDCs, UK, EU, US putting one in. All of this is positive. Do we think that it's likely that countries, people pointed towards China, for example, which is said peaking before 2030, are we going to see countries going a bit further before Glasgow? Are we optimistic that that's possible? And then the follow-up question in terms of what Farhana was raising, do we think others on the panel think that a more frequent cycle of reporting, A, will be politically acceptable, and B, will have the desired results? So Sam, maybe to you first in terms of the China question. Is a revised NDC or increased offer from China thought about possible, etc.? And sorry, before you answer, other people, please do put your Q&As in at the bottom of the screen. We've got a couple at the moment, but otherwise I'm going to keep firing questions, and they're probably not the most interesting. I think our audience will have much more interesting questions than me. So Sam, over to you.
So I'll say a few things about, I think, how we should think through where the ambition might come from in China. Just to quickly sort of put the conversation in context, and to refer back to a couple of the things that were mentioned. I mean, I think what made the Paris Agreement possible to a large extent was really in terms of the big kind of structural movements that needed to happen, in my opinion, for it to be possible. One, diplomatically, was the then unprecedented agreement between the US and China, between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping, that kind of created and changed many of the dynamics between, at that time, the G77 and the sort of global north, in terms of the way that the ambition could be framed and the way that the Paris could be made possible. The other actually was a massive shift in the real economy, particularly the falling price of renewable energy, which again has a lot to do with the scale of production in China and learning curve effects and so on, that were unleashed by China's own prioritization of climate-friendly technologies as strategic emerging industries, and kind of position themselves to be leading suppliers of those to the rest of the world. In the subsequent years, of course, Trump, blew that relationship out of the water, and indeed, reduced the US's the sort of modicum of trust that the US had managed to sort of build in the intervening periods. But China kind of stayed the course on Paris. And what that indicates, I think, and still is true, is that really China's participation is fundamentally about national self-interest. There is an understanding that participating in this process is important for China in terms of its own positioning as a leading supplier of clean technologies, as itself a country that's very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and that wants to see an economic transition that includes kind of moving towards innovation, away from polluting industries, dealing with air pollution, dealing with issues of public legitimacy around kind of pollution that's a major sort of issue of concern. So I do think there's strong domestic pressure and strong domestic interest for higher climate ambition in China. What's unfortunate is it's not going far enough. There's a strong support for green industry, but there's not yet enough curbing of the brown, as it were, of particularly of coal, and the current 14th five-year plan doesn't see the requisite level of ambition, partly because it's and this is explicitly really in the text, seeing a need for hedging with energy security in a context of growing geopolitical tension. And this sort of leads me to the final, I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out answer, which is to say this, China's, any pledge made by China this year is still part of a kind of a series of moving parts diplomatically that I think we still need to watch very carefully. And a big part of that is still the solidarity piece with that the rich countries need to offer. There's not only, it's not only morally incumbent on rich countries because of their historic responsibility and because of many of the other inequalities that we can point to that are, so richly symbolized by the vaccine inequality. It's not only morally incumbent on rich countries to offer something, but actually strategically, there's really no way to kind of move this unless rich countries kind of can go first and start a competitive dynamic of a sort of race to the top, particularly on the solidarity offer. I really think that's important. Otherwise, to put it sort of very frankly, China can fall into a very traditional position as the kind of leader of the G77 sort of countries, and not be pushed to be more ambitious. And I think that there isn't really any other way through it. So that's my slightly long-winded answer.
Thanks. Before handing over to Anna, could I just ask, where do you think the China hosting the CBD fits into or does it fit at all into their outlook and sort of ambition in relation to COP26?
In theory, that there's a really interesting interplay that you could create, and it was something that was talked about a lot in sort of high-level bilateral meetings and so on between the UK and China, particularly in 2019 and early 2020. And China clearly saw hosting, or maybe still sees hosting, the CBD COP15 as a sort of soft power gift, really. It's got eco-civilization, Xi Jinping's kind of signature leadership brand, in the title of a big UN conference. They are interested in exporting this concept of ecological red lines, which is a part of China's national conservation policy, and want to link that to the 30 by 30 targets and so on. So there's kind of an area here that you could find some leadership coming from China, and theoretically there is. China's also co-host of the nature-based solutions track under the UNFCCC. But there's really not enough momentum here, as I alluded to. Partly this is because there haven't been able to be, physical negotiations. Brazil were blocking the idea of there being online negotiations for a while. There was a kind of impasse there, which China did manage to push through, and there have now been online negotiations. By most accounts, people are very unhappy with the quality of chairing as well by the Secretariat and so on. The texts are just not being updated fast enough. There's not really enough kind of work going on to get things in place. And I don't really see much momentum here. And what I haven't seen is, for example, really interesting proposals about how you could link those two processes in practice. For example, you could have an NDC from China that includes elements of the offer to the Biodiversity Convention, or some attempt to coordinate the NDCs with their equivalent under the Biodiversity Convention, the so-called NBSAPs. So you could create kind of these more aligned, iterative types of proposals, but there's really none of that innovation happening at the moment. So I'm unfortunately relatively pessimistic about the chances of the coming COP15 really unlocking anything new.
Thank you. I'll come back to the others if you've got any thoughts on the CVD comment. But Anna, to you in terms of this question about shorter reporting periods, are you have any optimism that other countries are going to come in with higher pledges? But also then maybe I could add a question that's come in on the chat that I think is linked to this. We have the 2030 targets, but then there's also the net zero. And the question that, people are asking, it's very easy for companies and countries to pledge net zero 2050. Most people, not in my term of office, is a great, the NIMTOF syndrome. So is that something that, we should be more concerned about? Also, if you have thoughts in terms of what offsetting might mean in terms of some of the BECS and other issues, is that of concern? But maybe just, NDC increases, is there possibility, and how do we harden up, or will people harden up NDCs in any way?
Thanks. No, I mean, I think it's great when countries and companies commit to achieving net zero emissions, but as you say, it's quite easy to make these pledges far into the future, and we really need to act this decade. According to the IPCC, we must reduce global emissions by 45% by 2030 to be on track for 1.5 degrees. So it's not enough to set these mid-century targets. You also need to make sure that you have an NDC, which will get you there and get you on track, and that you put policies in place now that will put you on track to also achieve the NDC. And I think that's something that we shouldn't kind of forget in this super year, because we're focused so much on pledges and we're focused on delivering this global biodiversity framework. But often there is a huge gap between what is being pledged and the kind of the policies that are defining how we actually get there. I mean, the UK Climate Change Committee came out the other day with a report which described this discrepancy between the UK's targets and what it's actually doing. And I think, as Farhana said, we need to, we can't keep kicking the can down the road. Maybe it would be a good idea to have shorter reporting periods, especially for, I don't know exactly how to do this kind of logistically. It's also important to keep countries' capacity in mind, but most importantly, these pledges also need to be implemented. And there will come a certain point where, the public sees through this, that governments are making pledges, but they're not kind of implementing them. So I think what would also be really good this year ahead of COP26 is if we have a big push for concrete policies to show that we are going to get there. And that can be about, implementing bans on internal combustion engines by a certain date, phasing out not just coal, but also oil and gas production, and so on. So I guess that would be my response to that question.
Yeah, Farhana, please do come in on that. But
sure.
I'm going to add other questions on, otherwise we're not going to get through them. So please answer those other ones. But also, I think there's an excellent question. I don't know if you are reading the chat at the same time, but there's a question about creating a benchmark for companies and countries. Is what would be in your benchmark for these are the absolutes that people have to, or has to be achieved for there to be a success in terms of COP26? So, but do answer the other questions in terms of net zero as well.
Well, just I guess taking up the thread immediately from Anna about the net zero goals. So the net zero goal in the Paris Agreement was intended to solve two problems. One, that the treaty had no link with science, with climate science, and it had no end date. There was legally no end date and scientifically no link with climate science. So that's what we didn't have in Kyoto, we didn't have in the convention. Countries could come forward, this is the richest countries, by the way, could come forward and propose increased emissions targets and call them targets. And so this ratcheting an end date and this cycle, including net zero, was meant to be part of that. And the 2050 date aligned at that time with roughly a 50% chance at least and a 66% chance of keeping to 2 degrees and 1.5. So this is where the figure came from. It wasn't meant to be a goal for an individual rich country to take as a starting point, but equity, historical contributions, capacity, making good that gigantic gap which has grown, from the tardy implementation over the last 10 years in particular. So that's why most of the vulnerable countries, most of civil society want the deadline, as I say, 2030 is the new 2050 as far as you're concerned, and you should have put in place every single policy for an absolute phase out of emissions from the fossil fuel sector, and to have a balance in the land use sector. Essentially, those are our two big sectors, and they're not to offset one against the other at this timeline. So I think what it has done, and I think the merit of the concept and individual countries, cities, companies using it, is it exposes the good and the bad and the ugly. Those who have absolutely no interest in really changing their business practices, their business as usual trajectories, and are quite happy to take the easiest or least environmentally integral path out by buying an offset, or saying, actually, we're not even going to count our emissions. You have airports and oil companies that are saying, oh yeah, we're net zero, but we're not counting our actual polluting emissions. We're not responsible for our products in any way. So I think that it has introduced a huge discipline, a huge amount of transparency, a huge amount of accountability into the system when there was none, both legal and through, as I said, the demand for more detailed actions and plans and so forth. And I think that's where we're heading. We're heading towards that demand. Show us your plan, for 2020. Show us your plan for 2025. Show us your plan for getting there. Why doesn't it address this, and this? I think on that question, is it Javier Pujos who's asked a couple of questions at the very beginning? Yes, a lot of groups from the COP presidency in every country, has its own list of what would success for them look like. And frankly, for me, the UK's presidency's list must have nice picture of Boris Johnson with the world leaders and a few good headlines, saying there's still room for optimism. And actually, the rest of the world is coming to COP, especially, as I said, the 100 sort of vulnerable countries, with a very different success list, because it wants, real action against all of the benchmarks, all of the legal obligations, all of the commitments that we've negotiated for the last 10 years. We want those ticked, actually. And that's, the big difference. I do want to say, Antony, that, the vulnerable countries are not sitting around, waiting for a handout. That's not the case. In less than a week's time, the finance ministers from the vulnerable countries will be meeting, and they're putting forward, a concept of climate recovery prosperity plans. So these are action plans which are about marrying and aligning investment policies, aligning nature protection policies, aligning the SDGs framework, aligning climate all into one, especially at this time when, nearly every country in the world is able to and wants to build back better, as the phrase is. So actually they're putting forward all sorts of things, including ideas about insurance, including ideas about accelerated finance and so forth. And they're increasingly using their own funding and their own national funding to allocate to adaptation and loss and damage. So I just wanted to highlight that, because it's not, you know, the burden is already falling on them and they're having to meet it, whether they like it or not. They want to highlight that they would like more help and support, and that was legally mandated. So the checklists for success are very different. And globally, I think Chatham House, I'm sure, will be preparing a paper on this, as will others. And I hope that we will have more global headway and come out of this COP, not with everything solved, no COP solves everything, but that we will be handing over to the COP in Africa with a clear pathway to bringing those emissions down, with a clear pathway to not just the 100 billion, but an increased amount that is meant to flow, and with a clear pathway for how we will get a ratcheting up now to the levels necessary ahead of the lock-in of low ambition, which otherwise looks to be the default.
Thank you very much. We've got sort of 3 minutes. Sam, do you have any thoughts in terms of the specific things on a checklist for either COP26 or the CBD that you haven't mentioned already? And there was just this other question, which maybe you can't answer in this time, but in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative versus the G7's Build Back Better, any quick thoughts, really quick thoughts on either of those? That would be great. Yeah.
So on the question about the BRI, the question was, to what extent is this likely to become a stumbling block at COP26? And I do think it's one of the kind of diplomatic fault lines that is going to continue to. Is going to affect the kind of climate diplomacy. That doesn't mean that there isn't a potential here for a kind of race to the top between, a so-called green BRI and the B3W, the Build Back Better world. I do actually think that, particularly when we're talking about, how do you spur a global economic recovery, particularly in the most climate vulnerable and poorest countries. There's a serious conversation to be had about how you start that kind of sustainable initiative of refinancing. And I think there are signs that China in particular is really is taking quite seriously the concern around and the sort of rising concern around its overseas development finance, and is looking to find those levers it can, of which there aren't that many really obvious ones, to try to rein in some of their state banks and so on, so that they orient towards these more sustainable types of initiatives. So I think it is going to become a big stumbling block, but I think there are certain measures that they might actually take before COP26 that will help.
Great. Thank you, Anna. You have just a minute to answer. Again, this key question is, what's top of your list in terms of success or something you'd like to see happening in Glasgow?
I don't know if I have much to add to what I said before earlier, but just to reiterate this point about making sure that it's not just kind of richer Western countries that get out of this pandemic, but that there is a concerted push both on vaccines and on the economic front to make sure that we all emerge from this as soon as possible and in a green way. And that will also, it's not just a climate and biodiversity question, of course, but it will also kind of help on those fronts.
Perfect, thank you. Farhana, do you have anything else that you just want to reiterate?
You know what, I'm going to answer slightly differently. I think the acknowledgement and a way of tackling loss and damage is going to be the game changer at COP26. Because anything else is sort of fake. It's a fake kind of, greenwash, let's massage the headlines type of victory. It's not really looking at what's happening on the ground. And I think a way of getting people on the ground, those on the front line, those grassroots, other organizations that are really delivering and supporting people in real life and protecting ecosystems, that's what's really going to be seen as a success and is a success. So I know that I should be saying, let's get to the trillions and the billions, but actually I really think people on their own devices can achieve a lot, and they are able to look after themselves and nature very well, and they need acknowledgement, and we need to essentially devolve responsibilities and support and enable. And I see a massive, my new mantra is community is the new COP, where everything should be going via the community level downwards, rather than these rather top-down frameworks that we've done, which are great and necessary. So that would be my one request, and hope that we do that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I've been on a number of events during London Climate Action Week, and we have the smallest drop-off that we've had of all. So it's obviously stimulated people, and they've stayed on the call. So thank you all very much indeed for staying on. Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much for the panelists. And let's hope we come back in a year's time and we reflect on what success the next year has been. So yeah, have a good rest of the day, and yeah, be in touch. Bye-bye.